right. Bam. What up, Yang Gang? Well, I got a special guest in the house here. We got Cactus Chu with the Meta Politics. Let me put his Twitter handle up there. Podcast. How's it going today, Cactus?
Hey, everything's going great. I actually just finished recording and production for the next episode, which you can check out on any major podcast platform under the name Meta Politics, 2 words. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say just that we've hooked up because you reached out to me on a DM and said, "Hey, man, let's do some crossover stuff." And you're purely into the politics game, and like what got you into starting your own podcast first?
Yeah, so I came to politics really as a byproduct of researching misinformation and researching kind of the structural effects that various political factors have on the spread of information. So I'm originally a mathematician by trade, and very much my kind of aesthetic is analyzing things through various incentives, various calculations to look at what changes we can make and what long-term ramifications that would have on broader media and broader political systems. And the kind of narrative that very much took me by surprise, or the kind of result that very much took me by surprise, is the extent to which misinformation, particularly those that characterize conspiracy theories, actually go through mainstream media, go through almost every kind of facet of political life in not only the United States, but worldwide. So that's really why I wanted to try to equip people with the tools that they need in order to actually analyze these kind of effects, in order to analyze these various phenomena that lead to conspiracy theories circulating through mainstream television, for example.
Mm-hmm. So, like, if you're looking for facts with a capital F, like these are the facts. What do you consider the best sources for facts that you go to when you're looking to debunk misleading information? What's your go-to sources?
There's no one kind of definitive news outlet for it, not just because, not even in environments where there can be dishonesty, such as the United States, but in general, media is never perfect. So what I do is I always do a deep dive into any references that they make, any claims that they make, and actually try to look for the original scientific source if it was properly published, and to make sure that it is actually data that follows certain kind of scientific procedures. Right. You actually see a lot of data that gets published in certain areas, or at least news articles that kind of interpret the data to one given narrative that often is very unscientific, even if it's a source that is otherwise quote unquote reputable, or at least treated with respect in the American media. Mm-hmm. And this isn't necessarily just an American problem, but I certainly feel like, at least right now, I'm living in Canada for now, and there is a stark difference between the quality of media and the quality of kind of avoiding simple fallacies and simple misinterpretations of data that occurs at a much higher rate in American media. So one example of this, if you want to actually like concretely define some of these characteristics that are unscientific or that are actually misleading, one good example is correlation versus causation. So this is a very common effect that is well known, where people will look at two kind of values side by side that may go up in the same direction over time and may be more present in some areas versus others. So one common misinterpretation that occurs is that there are more coronavirus cases in areas where there are 5G towers. Now, these two data points are kind of collected through publicly available information. But the problem here is that correlation is not causation. In other words, that just because there's a pattern doesn't mean that one causes the other. Of course, the underlying explanation here is that 5G towers and coronavirus cases all occur in areas that are more population dense. So there are more people living in a smaller area. That's why you would want to build 5G towers there. And also the coronavirus spreads more easily in those circumstances. And
that's a very good point, that there are other factors. It is a factor, possibly, but the other obvious factor is density, population density,
Yeah. So one very good example of this phenomenon occurring with a very mainstream kind of narrative or kind of political message is the argument with regards to racial breakdowns in Silicon Valley. So Silicon Valley has a very high concentration of immigrant workers and particularly immigrants who are actually coming over on specialized visas for those jobs in particular. These are the H-1B visas.
Mhm.
Now, regardless of how you think about immigration, regardless of any of those opinions, this is going to have a fundamental effect on the racial demographics on the world. And one very kind of scientifically illiterate talking point that I hear very often on a lot of American channels is the quote unquote Silicon Valley or corporate boardrooms should look like America argument. This is simply flawed because there is immigration that occurs due to for these high demand jobs. And the world population does not look like the American population. There are much more Asians in the world than in the United States, for example. You can see the same effect playing out in higher education, and you can see the same effect playing out in areas such as Silicon Valley, where increased immigration results in a skewed racial breakdown. And nonetheless, there are prominent politicians and even so-called media figures that constantly push the narrative or the argument that this is due to some fundamental problem in how job selection works. And this is just simply, as I said, correlation unequals causation. This is a core example of an effect that is completely ignored with regards to just the general media consensus that Americans hold on both the left and the right.
Well, what do you think about like the fact that the trust in I guess you say quote unquote mainstream media has dwindled, I think by another 10% in the last 6 months. I believe it said it went down another 10% of people actually trusting the news, because I feel like journalism, the integrity has really gone to shit, and they're all being incentivized because of the almighty dollar, and of course it's a business. So what do you think about like because right now they've demonstrated why it's that way because of their I guess you'd say almost allegiance to a party, with Fox versus MSNBC both being like pretty much propaganda channels more than actual news.
Yeah, so those are some pretty strong assertions. So let's go from the first point and move forward.
Mhm.
So the fundamental media kind of gap between the quality of media in the past and the quality of now is not only just the actual incentives involved, but also the structure in which media stories actually get selected and in which communication occurs between journalists. Because what you have now is you have an increase in social media that not only influences the way that news stories are shared through them, but also the way that journalists themselves actually collect stories. They mainly do it through Twitter, which has obviously a negative influence as social media exacerbates a lot of negative effects, such as confirmation bias, where people tend to want to report on stories that they personally agree with, as well as negativity bias, where people want to report on stories that are harsh, that are critical, that may even be false, and may escalate some sort of ideological conflict. Looking at the long term in how media has actually ended up in this state, where they are more following financial incentives instead of various journalistic qualities, including consistency, including actually verifying their information, including following all these scientific standards. There's very much been a glut in media regulation. And unfortunately, this is something that is terrifying to actually discuss in this current political circumstance, because the political forces on both the left and the right simply cannot be trusted with further power, particularly further power over the media. However, you end up with an effect, and we talked about this offline, but we end up with an effect where you cannot simultaneously have freedom of the press, especially when that label is applied to things like Facebook or Twitter and other social network services, and freedom of speech. Because when you have essentially an information load that is arbitrarily large, where essentially there is too much data going around the world for Facebook to show you all of it, their quote unquote freedom of speech or freedom of the press is the ability to selectively pick between all of that data and to feed you any given point of it, right? It's not necessarily a question of kind of blocking X, Y, Z, although that does happen in some extreme cases, and slowing and kind of promoting some other documents. It's literally kind of a function that takes in a very large collection of information and cuts out a small slice of it for each person. And because of that, because that ability is fundamentally sort of their ability to pick and choose information instead of, say, to completely block information, which is a different question, that is going to be fundamentally protected. And it actually interferes, obviously, with the ability for all people to kind of get an equal hearing with regards to the idea of freedom of speech, at least with regards to its philosophy. So it's going to be impossible going forward to prevent monopolization through in this kind of way of various social networks and of the kind of arbitrary rules that they're going to apply.
Yeah.
And finally, addressing the media quality of the mainstream networks and their kind of political ties, there is very much a personal incentive to actually push people towards one side or the other. There is very much what I call the culturification of reality, where there are cultural issues that have been exacerbated to an extent where people interpret and where people are so strongly emotionally connected to one political side or another that they emotionally interpret a lot of these ideas in the same way that they would as a verifiable fact. Many people consider abortion, for example, to be those who consider it to be a killing would conceive of that in the same level in which they would conceive, say, the sun rising tomorrow. And the same is true for those who see abortion as a fundamental right, as they would also conceive that in a way that they would believe it to be something that is true on the same level of, say, a fact that can actually be proven. And unfortunately, because of this, there can be a partisan attack on any outlet that is on the right over these cultural issues, and also any outlet that is on the left over these cultural issues. And the diehard base, or even some people who may be considered more moderate but believe in those pre-existing mainstream outlets, will be dissuaded from going to said new institutions, even if those new services are completely verifiable, are completely consistent, and do accurate reporting on everything that they do outside of the cultural space. So essentially what you have here is you have a weaponization of these cultural issues to attempt to discredit any information system that doesn't fit within the two-party system, and moreover, any information system that doesn't actually pick a side within that system. So I think the overall incentive here isn't necessarily that, or isn't fully that there's a demand for more partisan media, although that may be the case for some small section of the population. I think there very much is some sort of demand that the people have for high quality media that is nonpartisan and that does report on things accurately. However, the problem is just reporting on a story accurately, if it's in that sort of cultural space, will actively be attacked by people who are engaging in bad faith, who are engaging in partisan politics, regardless of how accurate they are.
Well, I think that type of reporting is also problematic for the algorithm when it comes right down to it. The algorithm is set up to create echo chambers of, like you said, confirmation bias, where they get more engagement with clicks on stuff that is actually a little more partisan, and it's not as much work to think when everything's spoon fed to you, if you will, like to say, okay, I agree with everything they said, I trust this network no matter what, and then they're tripping the algorithm a little bit to say, okay, this one's getting more views per second, more follow through, more retention rate. That's where things like YouTube and all these other platforms are creating more, and Facebook especially as well. We're creating echo chambers where there's literally some people that don't see anything on my Facebook feed would never come up on theirs ever, because of their history of clicking on stuff and searching articles or Google searches, so that's kind of what we're up against, is this, what do you want to say it? It's the incentives, the money, works better for the companies to go partisan more. But I think that if we can help promote independent media places like, you have the TYTs of the world, you have The Hill, you have, what's it called? Reuters,
yeah.
Rudders. There we go. Rudders, not Reuters. There's other media sources like that do a little more. Well, I won't say TYT isn't biased. They're significantly biased, but corporately sponsored. Yeah, I think it's important to prop up and help promote independent media sources, independent thinkers. But again, here's the hard part about independent thinking: it doesn't mean you're right either. You can be an independent thinker and be wrong, dead wrong. That's why we have all these conspiracy theory channels that are, what do you want to say? Just very, very big support, like the Alex Jones of the world, that claims to be an expert or a eyewitness to these atrocities and never brings evidence ever. And people still trust him. Even the president of the United States quotes him, for crying out loud. So it's really troubling to see this tendency where even the president of the United States is easily fooled.
Yeah, so we have to look at both the kind of critical effect of various changes that we can actually hope to make, but also on the actual political atmosphere that creates the environment for these things to actually play out in the way that they are. For example, I don't think necessarily that the same level of polarization is present in many other countries, including the United Kingdom or including Canada. One thing that makes America separate is both its population, as the highest population out of all Western countries, and also the level of connectivity that it does hold. Moreover, something that was very interesting to me was the kind of French concept of laïcité, or secularism. And in the French version of secularism, essentially what it is it's a system where the most baseline level of public interaction is driven by the principles of kind of the nation, or of their kind of founding principles of French philosophy. And what this means is that no matter what other beliefs people may hold on top of that, which includes their religion, which really includes their personal beliefs, the first thing that you have to kind of have in order to enter the door of the public space, in order to understand how to act, is those kind of core beliefs: belief in democracy, belief in liberty, right? And this is very much something that isn't necessarily present in the same way in the United States.
No.
There's no expectation that people will act free of bias, that people will act in a sort of neutral way, even when they're members of the media. And of course, there are several media institutions that claim to follow some sort of objective standard, but I think it's that is something that is very easy to come up with evidence against, at least for the vast majority of those who claim that position. However, The actual thing that is strongly interfering with the ability for good information to rise to the top is the kind of intellectual filibustering that is occurring in various media spaces in the US. Essentially, what political actors want to do, what gains the most benefit for both the Democratic and Republican Party, is to make information as expensive as possible. Now, because the internet is sort of a free market, if there's someone who's offering information that is free, then you can't necessarily force information to be expensive in that way. However, you can make information very time expensive and information very emotionally expensive. In the first case, all it is creating volume, creating a sense in creating a sense of repetition, creating a sense of overwhelming for people who are trying to look for various political topics, particularly those that are highly partisan. In the latter case, it's actually something that aligns with many of those aforementioned social media incentives, because you have social media incentives that select for conflict, that select for anger, and select for negativity. And you also have a political incentive to reproduce those effects, because if that is what occurs, then people become unreactive to kind of media. They don't want to actually engage with news because it's fucking depressing, you know?
Oh yeah.
And because there is this kind of ongoing cycle between political influence and between a lot of these social media effects and mass media effects, the same thing is happening on CNN as is on Twitter, as is on Facebook, etc. You're going to have a cycle where these effects amplify themselves, and where, regardless of how much human judgment is in play, there is going to be a convergence towards a system where you have information that is everywhere, that is all negative, right?
Yeah.
Because there is just too much strength in those kind of parasitic arguments, in those kind of parasitic ideas, and not enough strength in actual human decision making, in pursuing more verifiable information, and in pursuing more high quality nonpartisan information. However, what the kind of tipping point is for this is a certain amount of information density. So is a certain amount of information that each person experiences in a day. And a lot of this is based off of the sheer scale of both mass media and of social media. And what is actually the critical thing to do here is to look at the fundamental bias that actually aligns all this, that ties all this together, which is narrative bias. So narrative bias is something that is incredibly powerful. I often say that the most valuable sample size is actually a sample size of one. And a lot of these kind of stories, a lot of these political tipping points very much fixate on one incident, one person even. You can see that with a lot of the communication around perceived racism. You can see that with a lot of the communication along even election security. You can see that with Russiagate, for example. You can see that with all of these like dubious political theories that have very little actual scientific evidence to actually back them up. And what I forget the original kind of author of this quote or speaker of this quote, but when you have the facts, then you'll try to push the facts. But when you don't have the facts, then you'll try to push a story. And that's very much what's happening and what is being enabled by these effects. So finally, let's talk about how we actually move forward and how we actually try to solve them. Well, we can try to solve them on kind of an individual level by communicating these tools. That's part of what I'm trying to do on my podcast, but also in having just a general perceptiveness to some of these various issues. Instead of having a strongly connected and strongly politically connected media class that tries to amplify these negative effects. You can have a strongly connected kind of nonpartisan or strongly connected, honestly, a class of, say, regular journalists, actual journalists who live up to those issues, and to have that information to be shared and to be relied on, that kind of overtakes what already exists. Now, one way to do this, at least to reduce the virality and to reduce the power of the existing American networks, is unfortunately to rely on a lot of these foreign sources. You have the quality of reporting at the BBC, at Globe and Mail, which is kind of the Canadian version of the New York Times that's actually better than the New York Times, etc. You can look at all of these foreign sources that are also available in English, and to actually maybe have those as a higher precedent, because the media in those standards are unfortunately, well, fortunately for them, but unfortunately for us, held to a higher standard, and actually have to follow many of those principles of objectivity to a much higher degree than those in the United States do.
Yeah.
So essentially, I'm trying to establish a framework in which we first source from those areas. We look to a lot of those systems, a lot of those foreign media sources, and I mean, obviously, I have an interest in this, but to look to Metapolitics, my own podcast, to try to establish a core of information first journalism, and to try to avoid a lot of those negative effects that I just explained later on.
Well, we got a question in the comment section here. It's kind of lengthy, but I still want to bring it up. So there's a guy in here. He's on. Most of you guys can't see it in the comment section either. The guys that are watching. This is a question coming from the Twitch. This person says he voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, economic reasons only. He's a critic of him because of all these social issues. But he says, however, as a lifelong Democrat, I was very disturbed by how I was treated by the media, Democrats, being called a race-baiting Nazi, bigot, sexist, among other things. I was not a typical Trump supporter. Okay, so his question is, Democrats and Joe Biden want unity with us, but in my situation, how can they reach out to me? When I was unfairly labeled and attacked despite having a reason to vote for him, that is very different from others, and someone who did call him out for his very outspoken critics of his. Well,
yeah. So there are kind of two questions I want to answer in there.
Yeah.
The first one is why such a negative and such a kind of personally malicious media system actually arises. And the second is what Joe Biden can actually do to push for stronger media security and media quality.
Yeah.
So on the first case, there's very much an incentive, as we talked about earlier, to push negativity, to push those fundamental ideas. But also, there is kind of a priority that we need to look at with regards to what is called, what I call on my program at least, shadowboxing. So shadowboxing is essentially the practice of constructing a fake version of your opponent and to try to take that version down. Of course, this is the quote-unquote kind of fascist dictator Trump or Antifa socialist Biden. You can think of those as the two tropes that were shadowboxed against. But the reason why you have an escalation and why you have an increasing degree in which not only to attack political opponents as something that they're clearly not, but also to attack their supporters as something that they're clearly not, is something that I call the Faustian growth bargain, where there is a promise that has to be made every single year, every single election cycle at the very least, that there will be growth, that there will be further opportunity. And simply put, the economic circumstances in the United States just aren't suitable for that. Obviously, we have a coronavirus pandemic, and both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are promising a strong recovery. And quite frankly, that is just simply something that's not going to happen. while they do have temporary supports, while they do have actions that they've taken to strongly boost the stock market, which is unrepresentative of the average person's lifestyle, then they're not actually going to have a sustainable pathway for economic growth, for job growth to the degrees that they were pre-pandemic for, I would expect, as long as a decade. So because of that, and you can see the same effect playing out to a smaller degree in the past election cycles after the 2008 crisis and after previous economic downturns, there's kind of been a promise that there will never be a sustained period of loss. There's kind of a promise that things will continue getting better at the same rate they were in the past, and that anything other than that is temporary. And that's simply not true. So if you have this irreconcilable lie that is being propagated by both sides of the political media, there has to be something to blame for that. And the reason why you have escalating levels of tension between the two parties and escalating levels of rhetoric against individual people who are supportive of one party or the other is because of this fundamental problem, is because they need someone to blame. And as the problems get worse, the easiest explanation that they can come up with is that these problems are getting worse because the people that they're perceiving as the quote unquote enemy is worse than they ever were before.
Right.
So what can Biden do to step off of this train? Unfortunately, it's going to take losing, and it's going to take losing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are kind of two effects that you can do to try to win at politics. You can try to reweight the issues, or you can try to build better positions and build better public support on the specific issues. And you need to do a combination of these two things to win. Now, unfortunately, in order to actually appeal and in order to actually sanitize the kind of media environment, the only thing that Joe Biden can do is bring up those wedge issues and to actually seek to compromise, to actually seek to make peace, and to say that we can move past all of these problems that I'm specifically going to mention, that we're not going to engage in a partisan knife fight, and that we're instead going to make progress on the public opinion on all of these issues. And most importantly, the public opinion, not only among the base and not only even among moderates, but specifically among those in the opposing party. And he also needs to actually address these fundamental problems. He needs to lay down the truth, which is this irreconcilable economic downturn, this irreconcilable path that we've taken, and to actually say, look, here is actually what's going on, and quite frankly, things are much worse, and it's much harder to do anything about it. Unfortunately, this means that he will lose. And if he steps down, this means that whoever the Democratic Party nominee will lose, because this instantly concedes a much worse reality than many people expected. And this will immediately invoke a negative reaction in the short term.
Yeah.
However, I still think it's beneficial for the Democrats and certainly beneficial for the country in the long term. However, that's simply not how most politicians think. So I essentially think that there's a 0% chance that Joe Biden will actually do that.
Well, and that's the thing. You got to lose. Like, they lost one election, and they didn't make many changes at all. And like you're saying, I think they got to lose for maybe 3-4 elections in a row to be incentivized to reevaluate their position politically, because the center has been moving farther to the right on the economic issues, and the center has moved farther to the left on cultural issues. And it seems like that is just kind of pulling the center apart a little bit, where even the center has become bipartisan on individual, like I said, economic issues versus cultural issues. And I think that's a problem we have here in this country, where these wedge things you're talking about, like guns, abortions, marriage, those are the big ones. Guns and religion, these huge wedge items that shouldn't there's simple fixes, but there's a lot of people in the way as far as like lobbyists and special interest groups. And when this guy was talking about being a lifelong Democrat and voting for Trump twice because of economic reasons only, I guess that's probably you're opening yourself up for attack on the social issues to say that you're choosing money over people. So I can see that's kind of what gets someone like him. I guess they demonized because you choose money over people, and that style, that reasoning for voting is really setting yourself up to be on the attack, honestly. And I understand you're trying to protect your money, but right now, politically, the cultural stuff is people, like shit. My shirt says it: people over politicians, people over corporations. So I'm a staunch believer in that, and I think if we take care of people economically, we'll do better. As you can see right now, we're not taking care of people, and economically, we are decimated in this country. And like you were saying, it might take 10 years because this whole 2008 downturn, we never really recovered. I think there's like a 30% job loss that never came back of those jobs. And now with automation, a lot of these fast food jobs, man, they're going to be automating away, flipping burgers and frying fries. And the drive-through is going to become like touchpads or some shit, and get rid of the people at the store, and everything's going to be automated away because then you won't rely on human resources as far as our presence because of global pandemics or anything else. So I think that because of this environment we're at, these social issues are economic issues, and even more so when it comes to the environment. That's a double-edged sword where there's economic ramifications and cultural ramifications and human lives that are being destroyed by these things. So that's why I think that someone like, again, guys, I'll bring that up. His name is Dark Sage 9117 on Twitch that one asked the question. So I think that's why you're being attacked, because of this current environment where the cultural issues are being so bastardized, if you will, and people are okay. So you're voted for Trump for economic reasons, and our economics have never been worse. Just for us as people, like you were saying earlier, Chu, the stock market is propped up, looking great for stock market or stock owners, but that does not represent us, the people, because I think it's less than 50% people own stock. I think 90% of the stock is owned by less than 10% in the United States. So that's a gross representation of how we, the people, quote unquote, are doing. So I think that's why people like Dark Sage that say they're lifelong Democrats voting for Trump twice is really hard to picture, but it is for economic reasons. But you're really setting yourself up for failure when you approach it that way. Fuck the people, I want my money. That's what it comes down to for me.
Yeah. So very much with regards to that specific case, I think the reason why I talked about cultural issues is very much that in order to actually de-escalate the media, Biden has to reject those half orthodoxies, those orthodoxies that are only present within half the country, and actually try to reconcile these sorts of different fields of reality that people are living in with regards to how they perceive fundamental questions of what the country is like, what actually drives politics, and so on. And what actually, I think personally, the narrative that reaches the most people is to show them the magic trick, to show them the game that's being played. Because this is what I call the arbitrary principle. And this is escalating with not just cultural issues, but with immutable characteristics, including race, including gender. And here is how the arbitrary principle is used to function. You exacerbate some of these arbitrary characteristics, and you emphasize them to the degree in which they overwhelm any sort of policy issue. And then you drive them to the point of kind of ad nauseum in the media in order to use that as a suppression mechanism for any other information, any other kind of logical argument that may arise. And actually, let me tell you kind of the worst case scenario of this and what we have to absolutely learn from it. So you might have already heard of Lebanon or of the explosion in Lebanon.
Yes.
And what essentially happened there is that government negligence resulted in 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate, a highly explosive chemical, sitting next to fireworks. And well, you can see what was happened online. You probably have on the news already, where entire blocks were leveled, homes were destroyed, and dozens were killed. Now, what led to all of this was not some terrorist attack, was not some act of war, and it was certainly not some hostile insider takeover of the government. It was actually something that is much more common all across the world, and what I see is going to be happening to the United States. So, Lebanon is a country that's kind of gripped by sectarian religious violence. And because of that, they had a system of government that essentially required that people in certain positions had to be part of certain religious demographic groups.
Right.
However, this became so driven by religious communities, which then whose leaders were then highly corrupt and using these as essentially power broker positions or essentially as patronage positions for those who financially and politically support them, that each person at each high role in government was not actually there because of any qualifications. They were there simply because they fit the role and was willing to play the insider game. But what actually enabled this was the fact that all of these religious officials were able to use the idea of religion, were able to use these kind of fundamental characteristics to mask over any governing positions, to mask over any competence questions. And you can now see the exact same thing happening in the United States with regards to race, with regards to gender. If people were actually trying to serve the interests of African Americans, and I'm not even saying that you should go as far as to divide up these groups, but if you actually were, then the top polling vice presidential candidate for doing that wasn't Kamala Harris, it was Elizabeth Warren. And in fact, it was by more than a double-digit margin. So what actually happens here is that these arbitrary principles, such as race, such as gender, are not used to accomplish anything. They're used to provide additional complexity to the system in order for them to actually sneak past the kind of common sense of people who are looking to see what is right in front of them and instead say, here's what we're focusing on. While instead in the background, they're always focusing on corruption. They're always focusing on getting the most dollars for the position. They're selling it out to various donors, to various other campaign officials, and so on. And all this is enabled because of these immutable characteristics. So once again, I always try to answer question in two parts because I see most people only answering the first part, which is what is the problem and what is the solution? Unfortunately, this is going to come as kind of a harsh shock to many people who are already on the cultural left, but we need to step off the train of allowing these factors to occur. Because while some people may find a value, may find a benefit in actually focusing on these traits and for focusing on kind of uplifting various groups that they see as deserving of it, unfortunately, what this is used for practically, what this is directed towards is fundamentally in serving the Democratic Party. And when Republicans do it, it's directed towards serving the Republican Party. So we need to step off the train of arbitrary factors. And there are economic policies that can actually be pursued to actually increase the circumstances, to actually better the circumstances of people who may be within those groups without focusing so obsessively on those immutable characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough situation we're in right now where everything is being politicized. Everything. You know, the weather, it doesn't matter what the hell it is. Sports is being politicized. Everything. And it's just not healthy. And I like the approach of a secular government where check your personal views at the door and represent the people as a whole. I'm an atheist, and if I had public office, I wouldn't take my own point of view and force it upon others with policies. That's the opposite of democracy, really, in my eyes. So, like, as an atheist, I would be able to go into government and say, okay, I will still defend people's right to practice their religion, but not impose it on others, because I have no alliance to any religions, like Christianity over Muslims or Jewish people or whatever, Hindu, Buddhists, Jains. But that's where we have, like you're saying, this wedge issues, man, is
Yeah, the fundamental problem, or like the psychological problem behind all of this is, I mean, it's sometimes called polarization, but I think a better term for it is calcification. Calcification, in the kind of more common sense, is when you use a joint in a certain way to a point where it kind of freezes and is unable to function anymore. And that very much is what happens with regards to certain political talking points that occur on both the left and the right. At some point, when you have information at this kind of volume constantly in social media and in cable networks and on print media that are kind of repeating the same sort of methods ad nauseum with regards to left and right, there is either a kind of learned agreement with them or a learned attachment to them, in which case people become very much partisan for a party, or there is a learned kind of detest or disgust of these political talking points. And you can see that in either case, this is very much based on the aesthetics of the message, not actually based on the fundamental outcomes, not based on anything that's measurable. And once again, this is something that is emergent from the political incentives that already exist. This is something that continues to push partisan politics, and it's something that is actually beneficial not only to one party, but to both parties. Because what this essentially does is it puts many people out of play. It makes it so that regardless of whether their interests are served or not, those people are then always going to be voting for that party for the simple reason of keeping the other party out. And what we can actually kind of look towards as kind of one small glimmer of hope is that if this kind of information pollution continues, there is going to be an increasingly strong opportunity for a third-party candidate. There already have been several attempts by left, right, and center, all unsuccessful so far, but there is a constant push, a constant force towards that level. And I think what we should actually be looking towards is how to influence and engineer media systems so that we pick our priorities right. And in my opinion, picking our priorities right means that we leave some of the incentives that in place that may be damaging, but that don't perpetuate themselves. So what this means is that we want to narrow down what set of possibilities or what set of incentives we need to remove or we need to change in order to make it so that a third party will win and that there can be more power and more kind of coalition building and agreement in order to force this level of corruption and this level of malincentive out. So what
I think that is something that can be addressed politically and in the media. You know, like independent media is also like a third party media where it's not left or right. It's not Fox. It's not CNN. Like if we have the media establishing a third lane, if you will, of bipartisan coverage, and then a politician or a party established that would challenge both of those in conjunction, that would be very helpful. You know what I mean? As far as good timing on that part. And I think now is the best time for that. Like I'm 100% on support. I don't think I'm ever going to vote for a Democrat or Republican unless they got an actual platform that makes sense. If they're just going to keep pushing to the top, the person they want, that's the moderate of either side. It just, so I think that now is the perfect time. So I'm glad you brought out third party. So I think now is the only time that this is a perfect storm where you might have Trump running in 2024 against Biden or Harris, and a third party option there, especially if things don't go well economically over the next 4 years, which is the opposite. I want the economy to come back, man. I'm tired of seeing people suffer. Thousands of people are in food lines in Texas. That's just showing the level of suffering going on. But if it continues this way, third party is the only choice we have then, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, certainly. And you have certainly seen various movements. You've seen kind of the more left People's Party. You've seen the Unity Party. You've seen
People's
I don't
Party.
know. The People's Party. The funny thing about People's Party is that it can basically mean whatever you want, and it's usually like far something. Like in Canada, it's a far right party, and in China, it's a kind of state communist party or state capitalist party, and then in the United States, it's this kind of like social democratic party. So really, it's very much just an arbitrary term that you can use.
It is,
but yeah, honestly, I think regardless of left and right, I think that the People's Party would be better, or like any other kind of third party, as long as it's not something that's like actively dysfunctional, that doesn't remove some of the corruption, that doesn't fit into the same level of corruption as before, would be better. Like, I think that if you just asked someone who's a diehard conservative if they would kind of like give up Medicare for all, as in they would let them implement Medicare for all, but it would remove the existing media infrastructure and remove the existing infrastructures of the Democratic and Republican parties. I think that that's a bargain that the average conservative would say yes to. And same thing for the average liberal who could say give up immigration restrictions or give up abortion restrictions to remove the Democratic media establishments and the Republican media establishments and kind of start anew. I think that this is something that even could be agreed upon. Unfortunately, the problem is not just with regards to gaining government power, though, although that is certainly a first step. The very checks and balances of the United States that have historically kept it stable have kept it stable because the center of power was more or less in the government. But that isn't the case anymore. The center of government is very much in certain businesses, tech monopolies, and very much in the media. And what that means is because of the relatively lax media restrictions, because obviously the founders didn't imagine communications at this scale, the center of power is now vastly unchecked. There is not insufficient media regulation. There is insufficient cultural standards to actually hold these media systems accountable for what they say. And because of that, there's even if there is a populist who takes control, there is a populist who, even let's say that they establish a third party and they win a majority in the Senate and they win a majority in the House, that is still going to be an uphill battle. And it's kind of terrifying to say that, like, even if they already kind of get to the point where they win the Senate, win the presidency, win the House, and it's still an uphill battle, it very much illustrates the situation that all of us are living in. However, I think that there's a great level of optimism to be had in the ability for individual people to actually think consciously. And quite frankly, I think that there are two convergent forces at play here. Okay, so as information escalates, as the game of politics escalates, these are the two things that are kind of in opposition, or the two bundles of things that are in opposition. There's the calcifying forces, like those wedge issues, like party ID, and that is actively pushing towards one thing. And the second type of force is the kind of chaotic force, which are the conspiracies, which are the corruption, which are the disconnect that economic predictions have with reality.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, the chaotic force is always going to win out. However, the degree in which the chaotic forces win out, or the actual outcome that comes from that, is going to be highly based off of when that point is and what kind of incentive we have leading up to that. So if there is a point where, and I call this the reality bubble burst, where people actually notice the drastic differences between what was promised by both parties to be the economic future and what the very real economic future was. Once people notice that, there are going to be sort of three possibilities. One is a kind of blip in time where either those forces get overtaken quickly by either one of the mainstream parties that weaponize this and translate it into kind of partisan anger. And this might actually lead to, say, far right or far left taking over. There's a second possibility in which it collapses into anarchy and no one trusts anything anymore, which, I think it's self-explanatory why this would be incredibly disruptive and cause probably thousands, if not millions of deaths.
Yeah.
And finally, a situation in which there is some sort of, I don't want to say opportunistic, but very much seizing the moment wave, where there is someone who is both compassionate, where someone who is an excellent communicator, someone who understands the political dynamics at play, who is able to collect all this mass movement to both rebuild a media infrastructure and to have sweeping governmental changes. And I think what we have to do is we have to focus on getting the right infrastructure in play. I'm obviously focused on the media end, on the journalism end. And I think very much there are good people who are focusing on the political end as well to actually have the infrastructure in place when that time comes to replace and to kind of stabilize the situation that we're living in.
Yeah, I think. Well, and what's the biggest problem we've had here this year was just with the coronavirus. You can't go boots to the ground activism to make change politically. It's all been pushed and given more power to the online media, the social media specifically. What do you think about the idea of a 21st century Bill of Rights? Like, our Constitution is unique in the way that it is written so you can have a revolution or very slow progress. Like it's hard to make changes, or you can have an absolute revolution within our Constitution by making amendments like prohibition. And then they got rid of prohibition. Like, that's possible. And also this incrementalism through Congress, where you can't really make a lot of changes with the checks and balances, because you could have a Republican president and then Democratic Senate and Democratic Congress and get nothing done for 4 years. I mean, it really does move at a snail's pace. So I'm curious, what do you think about the idea of a 21st century updated Bill of Rights that says, okay, we have the freedom of speech as is, but now we have to update it to contribute to help regulate, if you will, a framework for regulation for social media, for online threats, for online attacks. There's this whole new demographic. This, like you were saying earlier, the forefathers couldn't write about it. They can't predict the future. So I think we need a 21st century Bill of Rights that addresses freedom of speech, protest, peacefully assemble, freedom of religion, and freedom from religion, for me personally. And then also Second Amendment needs to be updated, to say, okay, now that we have 100 round magazines that can shoot a bullet every second, let's have a new type of registry, and to have like a national registry or whatever. An update on all that on a speedy process. That's a joke. A speedy process? You can be in court for 2 years and get no justice. So I think we need to update these things in a new Bill of Rights, if you will, that would help get our government to catch up with the technology that's at the world's disposal, but yet our government is a gerontocracy where you have geriatrics running the entire country and not everyday people. Where I think the average person in the United States, I think it's like 52, but the average congressperson is 76 or some crap like that, like 70 something. So what do you think about the idea of an updated Bill of Rights when it comes to 21st century problems, which is technology?
It has to be a constitutional amendment, and that's not happening until the thing I just described before.
Yeah, we've.
Oh, just a side note on the whole gun registry thing. There's a very cool technological solution, and actually, it's actually pretty kind of simple. The way to do a gun registry without the problem of a gun registry, which is information loss and or government kind of arbitrarily searching the registry without kind of reason to do so, is to attach a password to it. So each person essentially has a password. So if there is kind of a warrant to seek if someone has a gun, you approach them, you say, give me whatever your gun, and you provide them with a terminal that is properly encrypted, and you say, enter your password here, and you will be able to check if it's in the gun registry then or not. And this avoids kind of the fundamental problems of it while still having the idea in place. So that's like an interesting, just complete aside, like technological solution to that. I think very much balances out the priorities of both left and right.
Yeah.
It's not often that I talk about a policy, but that just seems like something that is very productive for both sides.
Well, I feel like blockchain could be that thing that kind of brings everyone together to say, okay, let's at least agree on how to secure our information through blockchain, which I really, really, really hope that our government can get caught up with the times, with the 21st century, to somehow use blockchain to secure identity online, first of all, and then use that blockchain to secure like a registry, even for cars, guns, medications. That way the identity theft is a huge thing. So if we had, like you were saying, a blockchain encryption key, when we log in, nothing, you can't do anything without your blockchain key. You know what I mean? Like
yeah. So the problem with blockchain is that it actually scales kind of badly. It's like, I actually kind of worked on something adjacent to this personally. And blockchain is not great at processing a large amount of transactions, because essentially how it's structured is that each transaction requires checking like a chain of like ancestors that kind of like show how everything led up to that point. And as there are more people using it, that chain grows quadratically. So essentially, like each interaction checks all the interactions on the chain before it, and so this makes it incredibly difficult to do with a large number of people, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, and they've had a couple of little mini breakthroughs, I guess you call it, on quantum computing, which is really what it's going to take, is quantum computing to I guess you'd say store and process and update. But again, we don't know if that's 5 days, 5 months, or 5 years from now, or 50 years from now. We just don't know. But there has been some promise there. So
the problem with quantum computing, I think the biggest one is interference. This is like kind of, we're not in Kansas anymore. This isn't the kind of stuff that I have kind of a non-layman's knowledge about. But from what I've heard around quantum computing, the interference problems are still kind of ridiculous, where basically background noise or like radiation will mess up calculations and will be actually untraceably, and will do so untraceably. So, right. Don't quote me on this. This isn't the area that I know more about, but that is at least what I've heard from.
Yeah. But like, I think with cryptocurrency using blockchain, that's a good demonstration on a smaller scale, of course, because we're talking about 320 million citizens in this country alone and billions around the world. But what's Steve saying here? The people running the computing is the issue. They can be evil and they show to be quite bad. Well, Steve, I don't know about that, brother, because here's the thing about blockchain is everything I see, you see. We all see the same thing. We just don't know who that number is. It's a ledger.
Blockchain is made to be not require trust, and that is the kind of beautiful part of it.
That's the whole thing. Is like, so Steve here is quite the conspiracy theorist. All of a sudden, Bill Gates being the gatekeeper and everyone. That's not how it works. So, like he was saying, it's the point is trust no one. That's the whole point of blockchain is that you have this. So if there's 320 million people in this country on blockchain, there's 320 million copies that self-corrects really quickly. There's a deviation, and it's easily recognizable. But again, the bigger the blockchain. Like if every single person was on it, it's going to be harder to.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's not like a full copy of every transaction in the blockchain, but yeah. No. So the idea of it is that like you can lie about blockchain, but if you lie about blockchain, it costs more than the entire blockchain. So that is the kind of idea behind it. And obviously there are technological problems with regards to scale, but it is essentially a system that unless there is some sort of breakthrough that we don't know about as of now, that completely changes the computing landscape, such as adaptable and like usable quantum computing, then blockchain will be something that is secure regardless of any sort of powerful influencer or billionaire, etc.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that actually is something that I think a lot about, not specifically blockchain, but also just trustless systems as a whole. I've been thinking of like various kind of probability games you can play to create a set of rules that allow people to garner positive information without actually relying on trusting any given person. But that is still something that I'm just trying to work out, and that there may not be a solution for, but I'll try to throw together the best heuristic that I can and eventually publish an episode on that.
Yeah. So I got like maybe 5 or 10 more minutes here. I just want to ask you a couple things about your podcast. So like, what is the goal of your podcast? What are your plans for it and moving on in the future here?
Yeah. So the fundamental priority of it is just to get the tools out there, get the information, get the systems of analysis, get those scientific methods and other methods that you can use to look at information systems. It's essentially trying to use the virality of information to our benefit. So the more people understand these ideas that I talk about on the podcast and I've talked about on your show, the more people can then educate their friends, their family, and essentially spread the kind of scientific methodologies that you need in order to actually personally sift through information and make sure that that stuff is true on your own terms, right? So that's the kind of broader philosophical goal for the pod. For right now, I'm just trying to kind of reach a larger audience, trying to cross-promote a lot, get more interactions, and to kind of build connections to not just improve the media system as a whole, but also to kind of see what I can learn from all of you guys. So,
yeah, it's fun, man. Crossing over. I love talking to people from other platforms that have different backgrounds. Like you said, you come from the math background. You know, I'm a healthcare worker. I have
thank you so much.
It's wild over here in Michigan right now, man. My kids K through 12 now are going to be staying home until Christmas break now. It was just supposed to be 3 weeks, and they just extended it to the end of the school, into the winter break, up until December. So, and now we're gonna probably stop having elective surgeries in Michigan. And I support my Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and her attempts to try and keep us safe from, I guess you'd say, non-compliant people that say, "Oh, damn it, I'm going anyway." They go to a place that's got 100 people indoors with no masks. Man, come on, man. But yeah, I'm at that place now with my job where I'm getting some uncertainty coming into December, where typically December is very busy because it's the end of the year, where people's deductibles have been met and they want to get their surgeries heading into the winter break.
I see.
That's not happening this year. It looks like we're going to go slow because they're going to stop having elective surgery. So like this is a whole new thing coming at us, where there's so much uncertainty, and that's what really is. It's not good for the economy. It's not, but yet stocks are up, like as the economy's looking bad, more restaurants are shutting down here. There's a couple small towns that have one restaurant and it's closed, not even takeout, because they just can't survive off that. But yeah, it's just really neat to come see more people, meet new people like yourself that have a different approach, which I really like your approach of just stick to the facts. If you don't know, say it, and to say, I'll look more into it. I like that. That's the best answer. Sometimes I don't know. I'll go find it. I hope I'll try to find it and let you know, like that really is the best answer 50% of the time, probably, especially if you don't have any, like I said, I don't know anything about blockchain outside of layman's terms, but I've talked to people that are experts that have experience with it. And I've tried to learn as much as I can from them by doing crossovers and stuff. So, yeah, I definitely appreciate your time, man. And I'm definitely going to be checking out Meta Politics. Again, guys, check them out on Twitter. What are you on any other social media platforms?
Yeah, I'm also on YouTube, and it's actually kind of difficult to find because I essentially made it. I haven't really cross-promoted it from my major kind of like audio podcast form, but I'm not sure if can you repost this to whatever platforms I sent. I sent you a link privately. Okay, you got it? Okay. But yeah, that is a link to the Metapolitics YouTube channel, which I basically just recently started, and apparently people are having trouble kind of searching it on just like YouTube general.
Yep.
But yeah, I am Metapolitics I am Metapolitics on every kind of audio podcast platform that you can listen to.
Yeah.
Link there on YouTube. I am Meta_Paul on POL on Twitter. And I don't really have any other public-facing social media accounts.
Do you have your YouTube link in your Twitter description?
No, I do.
That's the you just add it to your Twitter handle. You put it right there.
Sounds good. I will update that right after. Okay.
Okay. I have to address this silly Steve here. Steve, my man, start watching Other Information. She is Evil. He's talking about my Governor Whitmer here in Michigan.
Oh, okay. I was like,
to destroy people's lives. Steve, I'm in Michigan. Guess what? She didn't destroy my life. No one here.
I think the problem is very much with the assumption of malice, because as much as I talk about corruption, as much as I talk about kind of the maladaptive influences at play, I think that fundamentally, if you were to rework kind of some of the information channels that we have, and we were to rework some of the psychological conditioning that exists with many people, I think that you can have the exact same politicians in office, but if we change those incentives, they'll flip right back into communicating honestly, into communicating, into actually governing effectively, and in governing not to some false projection, but to the actual reality on the ground. But the reason why it's so easy to assume malice, once again, is because there's a fundamental lie that people kind of just go along with and they're too scared to push against, which is the lie of continual economic growth, in which is why there are these fundamental differences between what we all see in front of us and what's happening in the government. Now, it's very easy to say that, like, oh, Gretchen Whitmer is like buying onto this lie and is doing this in bad faith or whatever. But that's simply, I mean, it's a very hard reading of it, because, quite frankly, if you didn't play that game, if you didn't if you didn't make some sacrifices to actually get elected, if someone just came out and said, look, here is the economic circumstances at play, and this is different from what every other politician says. This is maybe more resonant with many people's lives, but is actually fundamentally going against what people actually kind of want to imagine, want to hope for, then it's going to be a very rough circumstance for them. I think so. I personally don't know that much about Governor Whitmer's policies. I know that she is a Democrat, and that's about it. But try not to assume malice. Maybe you can assume that she made bad decisions, and obviously you should argue that and vote accordingly if you think so. But I don't think she wants to destroy people. Maybe it's kind of like a tragedy of the commons, where there are negative effects that she kind of has to give up in order to actually end up in the position. And if she wasn't, then you would have someone else who is pushing the exact same things in that position. So just try not to get too angry at the people. Try to get angry at the underlying problems with the entire game itself.
Well, that's the thing, though. I live here in Michigan, where people like Steve or anybody, I'm not to attack Steve personally. It's just the same thing that I have people in their neighborhood that has a sign on their yard that says, "Our governor is an idiot," or "Impeach our governor," blah, 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 blah. And that's about it. That's as far as they think, the tip of their nose when it comes to these types of issues. Just this clickbait sign on their yard is like a virtue signal for their neighbors or something. But put yourself in her position and tell me, what would you do if you had record cases, if you had record deaths, and your hospitals are being overwhelmed? In Southwest Michigan, there's not enough physicians and nurses that aren't positive, that aren't COVID positive, to even man the fucking emergency rooms in Southwest Michigan. It's really bad right now. Steve, places like Florida aren't shutting down. For God's sake.
The number of cases in Florida are different than the number of cases in Michigan.
And okay, here we go. This is about trust, right? You shouldn't believe the cases issue. But Steve, you believe the opposite of that with no data.
Okay, so like
I work in healthcare. These numbers don't lie, man. I know that you think they are lying and have malice, but they're not. I watch people die in the hospital. It's not a fucking fluke. It's not a hoax. It is real. I know personally people in my own kids' school system, our own teachers, that still can't taste food. They still can't smell flowers because of this. It's not something you can dismiss as a conspiracy. And what would you do if all the data that is verified and supported by every scientist in the community that is trusted, that is verifiably within the scientific community, where it's been like, scientists love to disprove others. That's the whole point of science, is to say, oh, wait, you messed up. I'm better at this than you. I have proven to you your theory to be wrong, whatever you want to call it. Like, the scientific community have a set standards. They have set standards that's irrefutable. It must be observable, repeatable, and falsifiable. You know, you just can't create shit out of thin air and say, prove it's not real. You have to prove it's real so they can prove that you're wrong. You can't just say there's a teacup floating around Mars, prove it's not there. It's not how science works, you know? So for people to say that I shouldn't believe the cases issue is enraging, but I'd say laughable now because records, man. 2,200 people died yesterday.
Yeah. So
Pathetic.
yeah, it very much is like that sometimes, but I think we just need to understand that this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It doesn't happen in an environment where there is even like a decently functioning media. Like I don't think the BBC is like I don't think the BBC is somehow like sacred cow or somehow like optimally serving everyone, but it's doing a fairly decent job. And it's the same thing in Canada, it's the same thing in France, right? And they're also implementing their COVID measures. And we have to, once again, just return to the malincentives here, which is there is this principle of explosion. There is this fundamental lie that is at the base of both the Republican and Democratic parties, and in very much of the media infrastructure. So when that is already existent, it's very easy to kind of assume anything else. And it's terrifying to live in a world where you don't have that trust. So you want to try to kind of glom on to any priors that you already have. And sometimes that means acting in very irrational ways. So I think regardless of whether you're on the left or on the right, regardless of even your belief about, and I think that it's pretty, and I think that obviously the evidence is in one direction with regards to COVID cases, because it's not just the United States that is taking measures. Countries all across Europe, Asia, etc., are all taking very similar measures, probably actually even stronger measures, even though I don't know the specific ones in Michigan, but stronger than the US on average. So there are those kind of factors in play. But even if you have some doubt, just try to seek more information. You can check out the pod. You can check out just kind of fundamentals on statistics, where you think of things in terms of conjunction. So you think of things in how many things have to go right at the same time in order for this to work. And with regards to COVID cases, if there is wide scale misreporting, there has to be kind of like hundreds, if not thousands of people who are all in the chain of command, who are all collecting data, who are all lying about it, right?
Just like the conspiracy about the moon. Come on, man. It's hard to fake than actually going to the goddamn moon. It really is.
Yeah. So if you have a system where there is kind of this necessity for vast amounts of dispute, and when there have been challenges to, like, for example, there were challenges to the initial claims that that masks were ineffective, for example. There were active challenges coming from outside of the scientific community, and these were at the very least decently well reported. And there were kind of academic challenges to it. I don't think that there are any kind of challenges in that degree with regards to the actual, just the counting of the number of people with coronavirus. I do want to push back a little bit on the kind of academic defense, because there are structures, particularly in some fields, that are kind of insider trader-y. And I think the person who has covered this the best, and I don't necessarily agree with this person 100% politically, is Eric Weinstein, who has documented a lot of the insider games that occur at a lot of these scientific institutions. Yeah. But very much when there's kind of a straight survey, when there's a collection of verifiable data that probably exchanges hands dozens of times in various different geographic regions, and all of these other factors are in play when it comes to reporting the total number of coronavirus cases, it's incredibly difficult to organize something that would get that wrong. Mm-hmm. That would get that wrong on a large scale.
Yeah, man. That's why I do not entertain conspiracy theories. I just refuse. I'm just so sick of having to explain the same shit when it's so easily verified. And it gets me all fired up. So I'll just shut up about him. Me and Steve have a long history of him coming here trolling and defending Trump shit, but I just
there should be, the thing is, we have to be looking at we have to be looking at, once again, hate the game, not the player, and especially hate the game, not the spectator, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. The problem is that we live in a world where there can be kind of like chains of logic to this. Obviously, false chains of logic, but it's much harder to make an argument like this in the sensible media environment as opposed to this one, right? So if we address that, I think the rate of conspiracy certainly drops down, and that is part of the goal of the podcast.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to your stuff, man. I do got to get going. But I would love to do this again if you have a topic you want to dive deep into. It's fun. I love diving into data, just like on Nerds, man. Nerds is at times all about that data. I love it. The charts and everything, But yeah, guys, make sure you add that YouTube link to your Twitter handle. It'll make things much easier for people to find you. You can put it in your
great.
So guys, go check them out on Twitter and go check them out on YouTube. And I think this type of discussion is very productive to help weed out the bullshit, if you will, and not technical terms, But thanks again for joining us, man. And I appreciate your time, brother.
All right. See ya.